Hello, welcome to the channel. This is going to be the first of 2 or 3 videos going into everything about how Operator works and how to use it. I'm going to start from the very beginning, explaining what FM synthesis actually is, how to use it, how Operator works. I'm going to assume you already have a little bit of background knowledge about how subtractive synthesis works, at least. So yeah, this first video is just going to explain mainly how FM synthesis works, and then on the next video we'll hopefully explain a bit more about how Operator works specifically. So as you might have gathered, Operator is something called an FM synthesizer. What is FM? Well, FM stands for frequency modulation. Anything that changes the frequency of a sound over time is technically a type of FM. If you've ever used vibrato in a sound, then technically you've used FM before. But in the context of FM synthesis, we mean something a little bit different. So around the late 70s, early 80s, digital synthesis was basically limited to basic waveforms for the most part, like saws and squares and pulses, etc. This was mostly due to the limitation in processing power at the time. Then in the early 80s, thanks to some amazing innovation, a whole new world of complex and interesting waveforms and sounds became possible. This was all thanks to FM synthesis. Now, this sudden jump in harmonic possibilities is really well illustrated if you go back and listen to video game music from around that time. Consoles like the Sega Master System, for example, had a simple digital sound chip only capable of producing square waves and noise. Then the next generation of Sega console, the Sega Mega Drive, was outfitted with a Yamaha FM synthesis sound chip. The jump in harmonic complexity is pretty striking, even though the difference in actual processing power is relatively small. FM isn't just limited to video game style sounds though. It's actually insanely versatile for a lot of different things. Pretty much anything that has a lot of complex harmonic movement that would be difficult to pull off with a normal subtractive synth, FM excels at, like realistic bells, mallets, woody tones, or electrical pianos like in the pre-chorus to Billie Jean, or a really good example you should look up is a song called Whip Appeal by Babyface. The electric piano throughout that whole song is just that classic FM keys sound. And dialing in all the intricacies of that type of sound would be basically impossible if you're only utilizing subtractive synthesis. Even wavetable synthesis can only really approximate what's going on. Anyway, to understand what FM synthesis is, we need some understanding of what a note or audible pitch is. I'm going to make a statement that might sound weird and stupid, but believe it or not, it's true. There is no difference between rhythm and pitch. They're both the same thing. Whenever you hear an audible pitch or a note, all it really is a steady rhythm. It's a pulse repeating at a certain rate, and the rate at which it's repeating defines the sound's pitch. If you're still confused, let me show you something. I'm going to drag in a sound to this simpler device, and the sound could literally be anything. I could pick any sample I want here, so I'm just going to type in the kick and pick a random kick drum. That one's fine. Now if I turn loop on, obviously it's going to sound like a repeating kick drum, right? But if I enable warp, this is going to sync the rate at which it's repeating to the tempo of the track. So if I loop that kick drum again and slowly increase the tempo of the track, you can hear it starts getting faster. And sooner or later, it stops sounding like a repeating kick drum, and it sounds like a single synthesized note. As soon as the kick begins to repeat at a rate that would be considered within the range of human hearing, so that's somewhere around 20 hertz or 20 times a second, it begins to slowly change into something we would consider a single note rather than a single signal repeating itself. And the point at which this perception changes isn't really clear either. It kind of just happens at an ambiguous point without you really realizing it's happening. So just by changing the speed at which the kick drum is repeating, we've gone from a kick drum rhythm to an audible pitch whose waveform is the kick drum. The only difference between these two things is how our brain perceives them. And once we start perceiving the note as a single pitch, the signal is considered to be at something called audio rate. You may have heard the term audio rate modulation thrown around at some point. All this means is that you're modulating something or changing something at a speed that would be considered within the range of human hearing. What an FM synth like operator is doing is frequency modulation like vibrato, but it's at audio rate. If you're still confused, don't worry. Let's open operator now and I'll show you. All right, so I don't want you to worry too much about the actual specifics of what's happening with the synth and how to use it at this point. That will mainly come in the next video. So for now, just listen and try to follow along. So with classic subtractive synthesis, you generally start with a harmonically dense waveform like a pulse or a saw wave and create the bulk of the movement by decreasing those harmonics over time. So like filtering them out with a filter with an envelope on it or something like that. And we can actually do that in operator here, like this. So if we just select a saw wave here, that's a saw wave, and we can filter it out over time. So this is a classic subtractive synthesis thing. And we could put an envelope on that. But the power of FM synthesis is that we're actually approaching the problem the other way around. We want to start with a harmonically simple waveform and generate movement by adding harmonics to the sound. And the crazy thing about FM is you can actually get super selective about the type and structure of harmonics you want to generate, like this. You can hear that we're changing the amount of harmonic information, just like a filter would do. However, the harmonics we're getting are a lot more interesting than just a saw or a square, and you can actually layer these up with multiple FM oscillators at a time to create extremely complex sounds. So how is all of this actually working? Well, I've got this spectrogram here, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to illustrate. So all a spectrogram is something that shows the frequency of a sound on the y-axis. So a lower line here is a lower pitch sound and a higher line is a higher pitch sound, and then time is just on the x-axis. So all of these individual lines are actually our individual harmonics. So I can lower the amount of harmonics like that. So we still have our fundamental on the bottom, or I can make more and more harmonics. And I can change where the harmonics are by changing this oscillator here. So if we go back to just having our original sine wave sound, so this is just a C, I could either modulate the frequency of the sine wave using the fine control, so this little parameter here, see how it goes up and down, or I could modulate it with an LFO, like this. Or I could actually modulate the pitch of this bottom oscillator here with another oscillator. So maybe we'll use the second oscillator here. And if I slow the speed way, way down, like this, you can see it's actually pretty much the same as an LFO. This is how FM synthesis works, except it's happening at audio rate. So this modulation is usually happening really, really, really fast. So this second oscillator here is also a sine wave. So we've got two sine wave oscillators. This bottom one is the one we're actually hearing. So if I disable this and then enable this top one, we're not actually hearing this top one. We're only hearing the effect it's having on the bottom one. And the way it's affecting the bottom oscillator is it's affecting its frequency or pitch. And it's affecting it in a sine wave shape, see? Now, if I increase the speed of this modulation, listen to what happens. We start to get all of these interesting harmonics happening. And once we get to the frequency of our original sine wave, the harmonics start to become more discrete and organized. And importantly, the frequency of our original sine wave stops moving at that point too. So our ears are hearing a specific note being played again, because the fundamental frequency isn't changing. It's only the harmonics on top that are changing. In fact, the fundamental frequency will actually stay the same no matter how much it's being modulated, as long as the modulation frequency is at or above the original sine wave's frequency. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing again. So a sweep from slow modulation to fast audio rate modulation, except this time I'm going to play a note that is around 100 hertz. So it's going to be about a G. And I want you to actually keep an eye on the exact speed of the modulation. So that's going to be this little hertz number here. So I just want you to listen and keep an eye on this number and see if you can see any patterns in regards to the speed of the modulation and the actual note that's being played. So yeah, this sine wave is around about 100 hertz, and I'm just going to start modulating it at different speeds. So 10 hertz. See if you can pick out any patterns. What you hopefully observed was that whenever our modulating wave approached a nice stable multiple of our original sine wave, it almost became super nice and stable sounding compared to all of the other values. That's because at those points, the harmonics we're generating begin to line up with the harmonic series relative to our fundamental. And they're also mathematically related to each other in simple ways and fit together nicely. Whereas between those values, you get a lot of very complex mathematical relationships, which results in a grittier, nastier, inharmonic sound. And if we actually disable this fixed option here, we're going to get this coarse parameter instead. And all this is it's just jumping and snapping to those nice ratios. And remember, we're not actually hearing the sine wave on the top here. We're just hearing the effect it has on the bottom sine wave. Now, you can actually get in between these coarse values here by using the fine control. And that is actually something you might want in certain scenarios. Say, for example, you're creating like a percussion sound or a bell or something metallic. Usually those things are going to have harmonics that aren't nicely related to each other. So that might be a good starting point. All right, so small recap. We have this oscillator down the bottom here, which is the one we can actually hear. And we have another oscillator on the top in this example, which we can't actually hear, but we can hear the effect it's having on our bottom oscillator. And the correct terms for these two different types of waves are the carrier wave, which is the one you can hear, and the modulating wave, which is the one you can't hear, but you can hear the effect it's having on other waves. And remember, each of our oscillators actually have their own unique separate envelope attached to them. So not only can we get super specific about the amount and placement of the harmonics that we're generating, we can actually get specific about the envelope of those harmonics, or the like sculpting those harmonics over time, like this. This is what makes FM so powerful. And you can actually have multiple carrier waves or multiple modulator waves, which brings me to the next major aspect of FM synthesis, which is the algorithms. So if we click on the shell down the bottom right here, this actually opens up the global settings for operator. And within those settings, we actually have the algorithm selection. So you can see we actually have 11 separate algorithms we can choose from. And they have a set of 4 squares each. And those 4 colored squares correspond to the colors next to each of these oscillators. So you can see oscillator A here has a yellow square, oscillator B, green square, C, teal, blue square, whatever it is, and oscillator D, orange square. And by the way, in FM synthesis, usually these separate oscillators are actually called operators. So operator actually has 4 separate operators within it. So that's kind of confusing, but that's the way it is. And that's where operator got its name. So by clicking one of these algorithms, we're giving the synth instructions about what oscillators or operators are going to be modulators and which ones are going to be carriers, and which order are they going to be in. So for this first example here, we'll just go through it. Oscillator D is going to be modulating oscillator C, and you can tell that because there's this little tiny line in between them. Hopefully you can see that. And then oscillator C is going to be modulating oscillator B, and then oscillator B at that point is going to be modulating oscillator A. And then oscillator A is not attached to anything, so it's just going to be our carrier wave, and we can end up hearing that one. By the end of it, we're going to be hearing what this big stack of FM synthesis is doing, the effect it's having on our carrier. We're going to end up with this super harmonically dense wave. So if we go through and turn on each oscillator at a time, bring up the level, make sure the sustain is all maxed, put each one just at a ratio of 1:1, and just bring the level of each one up one by one. So, you know, that's pretty harmonically complicated, but we could also go in at this point and change the algorithm. So at this point, if we change the algorithm to, say, for example, this next one, you can see here that oscillator D, so the orange one, is going to be modulating oscillator B. So it's actually not a modulating oscillator C in this example, it's skipping one. So it's just going straight to oscillator B. But then at the same time, you have oscillator C separately modulating oscillator B. So we have these 2 oscillators, and they're both modulating the one oscillator. And then at that point, this oscillator that is also being modulated at this point is going to be modulating oscillator A, and then we're going to hear oscillator A at that point. So in this example, we still have 3 modulator waves and 1 carrier, except the difference is these top 2 aren't in a like FM sort of chain. They're just separately modulating oscillator B, and then we're hearing that effect. So after selecting the second algorithm, and without even playing a note, I can tell that it's probably just going to be slightly less harmonically complicated or dense, and the harmonics will probably have a slightly different structure. So if I play a note and just go between algorithm 1 and 2, you can hear what's happening. So what I want you to do at this point is probably just open up Operator and make sure all of the envelopes on each of your oscillators have max sustain, and then pick a random algorithm here that I haven't talked about yet, and just see if you can figure out what's happening, and bring up the level of each oscillator up one by one, and see if you can sort of follow what's going on. So for example, another simple one would be this one that just looks like a 4 operators in a sort of square configuration. And you can see that we have basically 2 separate sets of FM happening. So we actually have 2 carrier waves. So our carrier waves would be oscillator A, the yellow one, and oscillator C, the teal or blue one. And then our modulating waves would be D and B. So you can think of the synth now actually having 2 separate audible oscillators here, and we're just changing the harmonics of each one by changing the level of our modulating waves. So that's D and B. So if I bring D and B down, you can hear that if I change the level of C here, all that's happening is the amplitude is just changing slightly. So we're just getting a quieter signal when it's at -infinity, and when I bring it up to 0, it gets slightly louder. That's because both of them are at the same pitch. But if I bring the cause value up to like 3, you'll hear that now we should get 2 separate notes or harmonics. And I can change the fine tuning of the second one here. And if I bring our modulating oscillators into play here, we can change the harmonic content. Just going to pick random course values, see if I can make something a little bit interesting. Now I can mess around with the envelopes of each oscillator. So that's a pretty sweet sort of house kind of lead. You could get that sound with a wavetable synth. The irony of that though is that the actual wavetable you would have to use was probably created using some FM. And also the downside of using a wavetable synth for that is you don't have so much control over the stacks of different FM. Like for example, you can get really creative with the way you route these modulating oscillators. So you could route the level of them to like velocity, for example. So when you play really soft, you get less harmonics. When you play really hard, you get more harmonics. But then you could also route the velocity to like the fine tuning of one of them as well, or maybe even like where you're playing on the keyboard. So low notes will have way more harmonics, and then high notes will have less. So yeah, and you have a filter on top of it too. So in ways, wavetable synths are great because you have a lot of harmonic movements early in the process, and you can process that to your heart's content. But with FM synthesis, I think you just have slightly more control over the nuances of the harmonics and stuff like that. And plus, learning an FM synth like operator is just like really fun, because after a while you start to recognize patterns of like what ratios of FM modulation, what effect they have on your carrier signal. So you start to realize like, oh, maybe I want a ratio of like 3:1 to get this specific type of saw pluck kind of sound. And maybe if I want to have like a sort of metallic xylophone sound, maybe I want to have a higher ratio. So maybe like 12:1 or something like that. All that would mean in this scenario is we would have a coarse value of 12 on our modulator and a coarse value of 1 on our carrier. So that's a ratio of 1 to 12. And so a ratio of 1 to 6 would be, you know, we could change the bottom oscillator to 2, so that's 1 to 6, or we could change it back to 1, and then change our second one to 6. Hope you're following along with that. So yeah, don't think too hard about like ratios and the mathematical relationships and crap like that. Just pay attention to the values you've set and the sound you're hearing, and you'll get the hang of it pretty fast. I do have a tip though for getting started with using your ears with all of this FM sort of stuff, and that would be that even ratios tend to generate odd harmonics. So a lot of people describe that as sort of sounding hollow or something like that. And odd ratios are going to generate both even and odd harmonics. If you're after a more buzzy sort of saw wave sound, I guess, go for odd ratios. But also, if you're unsure about the sonic difference between even and odd harmonics, FM synthesis is also an amazing way to train your ear to those differences, if you keep all of this stuff in mind anyway. So either way, it's a great sort of type of synthesis to learn if you want to broaden your skills as an audio engineer or sound designer or whatever. So just a broad recap of what we've gone through in this video. All FM synthesis is audio rate modulation of a sound's frequency to generate more harmonics. So we're starting with a harmonically simple sound, usually like a sine wave, and then modulating it with another sine wave at audio rate to generate more harmonics. And Operator does that with 4 separate oscillators, and these are also called operators, and these all function exactly the same, and you can route them to do different things. So either be a modulator or a carrier, which is the one you can hear. Modulator you can't hear, but you can hear the effect, blah blah blah. Anyway, you get the point. You can change what they do by changing the algorithm, and all an algorithm is a sequence of instructions saying, hey, I want this oscillator to be a modulator, and I want it to modulate this carrier, and I want to do it in this specific order. All right, so hopefully you're still with me at this point. I'd just like to add a couple more points at the end, which is old school FM. So like all of the old FM synths from the 80s and 90s and stuff, most of them didn't even have filters. So make use of the filter in Operator. You can get some really complex movement happening with the FM section, and then change it even more with the filter section. And another thing to keep in mind is that this whole video has been a lie. Well, kind of. That's because Operator and most other FM synths don't actually modulate the frequency of the carrier wave with the amplitude of the modulating wave like you might assume. They actually modulate the phase of the carrier wave. Now, this is mathematically identical to actual frequency modulation when it comes to using sine waves for your modulating waves. So in those cases, the distinction doesn't really matter at all. But if I do the same thing that we did at the start of this video and slow this modulation down really slow and change this modulating wave from a sine and instead use a saw wave, we don't get frequency modulation in a saw kind of shape. Instead, we just get no frequency modulation and a series of clicks. And if I change this to a square wave, we get the same clicks, they're just twice as fast. So those clicks actually correspond to every time the waveform is changing its sort of trajectory, I guess you could call it. But don't get too hung up about avoiding using everything but sine waves for FM, because after you start getting back into audio rate, things start working a little bit better again. And using waveforms other than sine waves is actually a good way to generate more harmonically dense sounds. However, if true frequency modulation was happening, the sound would be a little bit different. So don't get too worried about true frequency modulation versus phase modulation and all that sort of stuff. I just thought it was an important distinction to make so that you know exactly how Operator is working as we dive deeper into this tutorial series. If you really enjoyed the video and you got something out of it, I'd really appreciate a subscription so you don't miss any future videos, and more importantly, so you don't miss future videos in this series. I also have a Patreon. It's pretty affordable, and there's sample packs and like exclusive racks and exclusive tutorials, plus a bunch of other stuff. So definitely check that out if you want. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in part 2. See you later.